me for a couple of minutes. The first thing that I'd like to say is a big congratulations to our committee members, Matt and Kate, who have recently had a baby. So congratulations to them. He's absolutely lovely, a wonderful bouncing baby boy. Today, as normal, we're doing our talks again over record due to the current pandemic. That's still an ongoing issue. We are in conversations back with the club, and as soon as they're able to, they'll give us the get-go and we'll let you know when our meetings are going to go back to normal. We won't do that until we're completely satisfied that it's a safe environment to get everyone into, so there'll be no worries on that side, and we'll let you know. This month we have a fantastic talk by Tariq on reptile diseases, common viral reptile diseases. So I'll pass you over to him now, and it should be a really good talk. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jenny. So I'm going to talk to you about some common reptile viral diseases. I think a lot of people know me, but for those that don't, my name's Tariq. I am an exotic vet. So I'm a vet. I only deal with birds and reptiles and small mammals and things. I don't do any cats or dogs anymore. And reptiles probably a sort of a third of my caseload, I guess, about a third of what I see in practice. And obviously viral diseases are a big sort of up and coming topical area within reptile medicine. So yeah, I'm delighted to be able to talk about this for a little bit tonight. And if anybody's got any questions, obviously this is a pre-recorded talk, but I'm sure if you put those on social media afterwards, or let the West Midlands Herpetological Society know, then I should be able to come up with some answers, and we can post those then later. It's a bit funny not being able to do a talk with the interaction that you normally get, but nonetheless, we'll see how this goes. So I guess if we start with the very basics, obviously viruses are microscopic organisms. They're parasitic organisms. They reproduce inside living cells. They need living cells to reproduce. And obviously we're in the middle of a global pandemic, so viruses are very topical at the moment. In the top corner of my screen here, you can see a sort of spherical grey structure. There's got some red bits sticking off it. So this actually is COVID-19. This is the virus. This is what it looks like under an electron microscope. And this is basically what your average virus kind of looks like. So it's got these surface proteins. And then the gray bit that you can see here, that's called the envelope. And that's made of like lipids, fats, basically. And you get some viruses that have an envelope, and you get some viruses that don't have an envelope. And generally, viruses that have envelopes are a bit easier to kill outside of the host, because that lipid layer, that oily layer, can be broken down with things like disinfectants and soaps. And actually what you find is that non-envelope viruses can last sometimes years outside of the host. And different viruses obviously will fit into either of those categories, either enveloped or non-enveloped. So that's basically, so viruses are obviously nasty things, and they affect all organisms pretty much. But for some reason, reptiles seem to absolutely love and attract viruses. And until sort of probably the last 10, 20 years, we didn't really sort of know about this. And it's only in the last few decades that actually we've managed to find some of these viruses in sick reptiles, and we've been able to say, well, actually, these are, you know, some of the common causes of some of these common clinical syndromes that we see, things like respiratory infections and mouth rot. You know, viruses can play a huge role in those very common disease syndromes. And I think this is an area where we're going to see a huge amount of research and more development over the next few years, and certainly in a few decades' time, I think we'll have way more viruses identified than we do now that we know are problematic. if people are buying or selling or keeping reptiles, although this may seem a bit technical, and you may sort of think, well, I will only sort of buy from local breeders and I use good disinfectant and I quarantine all my animals, I think it's really good to have some basic knowledge of some of these viruses. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to run through a few of the more common viral diseases that we see in reptiles. And then towards the end, I'll just go over a little bit about how we can minimize the spread of viruses and minimize the incidence of viral diseases. And we'll go from there. Now, loads and loads of viruses have been found in reptiles, but only a few have been shown to cause clinical disease. But no doubt, many of the ones that have been found that haven't been linked to disease syndromes may well be in the future. And viral disease, an important thing to consider in captive reptiles, but also something to consider where we're dealing with wild reptiles as well. And there are lots of important conservation issues linked to viral diseases, and there'll be one or two examples of some of those in wild reptiles as we go. If anybody is really interested in this and would like to read into this topic a bit further, I think these are probably the 3 books that I would recommend. And as well as sort of viral diseases, these are very comprehensive and go into lots of detail about lots of reptile and amphibian ailments and health conditions. So The Infectious Diseases and Pathology of Reptiles by Jacobson is a very good book, very sort of bit technical, but very interesting, very focused on infectious disease. The book in the middle, which is Reptile Amphibian Medicine and Surgery by Divers and Stahl, is the most recent edition of the book, which probably a lot of people will have heard of, which is Maida's Reptile Medicine and Surgery, which is sort of the Bible of reptile medicine. And this latest edition is very, very thick. It's full of useful information and lots of information about viruses. And then The Current Therapy in Reptile Medicine and Surgery is a smaller book, but it's got some quite nice chapters. There's a bit about RANA virus in there, and also an update on viral diseases. So all these books are available on Amazon. They're not that cheap, but a very sort of worthy Christmas present or something like that, I think, or if you're just stuck for something to do while you're in a lockdown. So the first disease syndrome that I'm going to cover is inclusion body disease in snakes, which is also known as IBD, the acronym. I think this is probably the most famous viral disease that we see in reptiles. I think it's the one that sort of we knew about first. It's the one that probably you'll find the most information about. And it remains an extremely problematic issue, and it's something that I see in my day-to-day practice very commonly. So certainly it's out there. And this is a disease, inclusion body disease, that affects boas and pythons. And it's called inclusion body disease because the viral disease causes these what's called inclusion bodies, which are little sort of protein deposits that you see in certain cells, so particularly in epithelial cells and in neurons, so nerve cells. And you see those in a wide range of tissues. Boas seem to have a slightly different clinical disease syndrome to pythons, in that boas especially may remain clinically healthy for many, many months, sometimes years, even though they're infected with this virus and they've got the inclusions. Whereas pythons typically, but not always, but typically will show a much more rapid disease syndrome once they're infected, and you're more likely to see clinical signs and potentially mortality and deaths within sort of a few months. And what you often find is in collections which are sort of mixed boa and python collections, the pythons are almost like the canary down the mine, in that they all of a sudden go downhill very rapidly, and you know that there is a problem there, and that probably the boas have been exposed as well. And that's something to consider. And there is an argument to say that potentially boas and pythons ideally should be kept separated because of the risk to the pythons from boas who may remain healthy for a long period of time and may never succumb to the disease even though they've got it. So there's one interesting study that got published in 2012, which showed that arenaviruses are the probable cause of inclusion body disease. And I think that's pretty much now accepted as the cause. And there are lots of different arenaviruses, and sometimes snakes with inclusion body disease will have multiple different species of arenavirus. And do you remember I said that some snakes remain healthy for a prolonged period of time? So particularly boas, sometimes pythons. And we don't really know what is the trigger, what sort of makes some snakes develop disease, whereas others just sort of keep it at bay and sort of carry it silently almost. We don't really understand what distinguishes whether the snake is going to go down with illness or whether it's not. And one of the theories is that potentially it's a certain combination of viruses or a co-infection or a super-infection, which may be the trigger for the actual development of disease. So I've got a couple of pictures here. These are boas that are infected. And in the next few slides, I'll go through some of the clinical signs that we see. But I guess the most classic sort of clinical signs that we see in boas with inclusion body disease are neurological signs. So it affects the nervous system, and we very commonly will see snakes that sort of lose their righting reflex, that flip over on their back, and because they got a problem with their nerves, they're unable to right themselves. They sort of lose their balance and their proprioception. And sometimes you see snakes sort of twisting themselves up in knots, like this boa here on the right. Very often these snakes are poor doers. You know, they're not eating brilliantly well. Obviously, because their sort of locomotion is impaired, they may have difficulty shedding, and very often these snakes will be under condition and noticeably underweight, and those sorts of things get worse as the disease progresses. So in terms of inclusion body disease, obviously central nervous system signs are the classic signs that you see, as well as not eating. But this is a neurorespiratory virus. So people often forget this can cause respiratory disease as well as neurological disease. And sometimes you don't see any neurological signs. Sometimes you just see respiratory signs. So you basically get a boa or a python with a respiratory infection, an RI. And a lot of people sort of forget that a lot of these viruses can be implicated in RIs. So they'll spend, months and months and months treating with nebulization, sometimes giving some antibiotics. But, actually the problem is that this snake does have an underlying virus, and it's probably not something that we're going to be able to cure. And for as long as you sort of keep that snake going, you're potentially, sort of causing a prolonged illness, really. And, for as long as that snake is going, it poses a risk to other animals. And so for any respiratory infection, ideally, if the funds are there in a boa or a python, really we should be testing these for certain viruses, and certainly inclusion body disease, arenavirus, would be well worth testing for. So there's a couple more pictures here. One of the things that we see quite commonly with inclusion body disease is because it affects the nerves, it can often cause a difference in pupil size. So you'll often get one pupil that's a lot more dilated than the other one. And the medical term for that is anisocoria. And that just basically happens because there's impaired innervation. The nerves to the iris and the nerves affected, innervating the eye, are damaged. So if you're buying a snake at a show or from a shop or somewhere, have a look at it. Get it out and have a look at its eyes. Make sure its pupils are equal in size. The other thing that we'll frequently see, as I mentioned before, is sort of a poor body condition. So you can see this royal python here is very sort of slim with this very prominent spine, and an animal such as this would be an animal to avoid if you're looking to take on a new snake. Inclusion body disease is common. So there was one sort of slightly informal study that showed about a third of boa constrictors in the UK test positive for arenavirus. It's got a worldwide distribution. We see it in pretty much all European countries. It's very common in the United States, and we see it around the world. And think about reptile shows. You know, think how many boa constrictors are at your average reptile show. You know, by the law of averages, when you walk into a reptile show, you are bound to be walking into a room where there is arenavirus. And that probably also is the case, you know, in sort of large reptile wholesale facilities or anywhere really, even large collections of boas where the animals have been sourced from multiple different sources, often from multiple different countries, and where no testing has been done. You know, it's very likely that there is some arenavirus in those situations. So just be mindful of that. If we are suspicious that arenavirus is going on, then we can look for those inclusions in the tissues. And that's obviously much easier in a deceased animal because we can collect tissues from lots of different organs, brain, central nervous system, pancreas. And we can do histology on those and actually look for the inclusions in multiple tissues. Usually in pythons, we see the inclusions predominantly in the central nervous system and mostly in the brain. Whereas in boas, and potentially it's because of their sort of more protracted disease syndrome, we'll often see inclusion bodies in multiple different organs. And sometimes we'll even see inclusion bodies in blood cells. So sometimes even when you do a blood test and you look at a blood smear, you can see that there are inclusion bodies there. So if you see the characteristic inclusion bodies, obviously that's very suspicious. I mean, it's almost diagnostic for a virus of some kind, but you can often be fairly certain that what you're dealing with is arenavirus. But you can then also do PCR testing. So that's what we would typically do in a live animal, although you can take biopsies from the tonsils and sometimes from other organs, but sort of a less invasive starting point is to do some PCR testing, which we do with blood samples and swabs, and see if it comes back positive for arenavirus. Sadly, this disease, inclusion body disease, is not a disease for which we've discovered a cure as of yet. And, you know, often these animals, by the time we notice them, are quite sick. And, you know, often, sadly, the best thing for them is euthanasia. And in terms of healthy animals, sort of healthy carrier animals, there are some animals that may have this that never show signs of disease. And obviously there is, you know, a very, very sort of good argument to say that those animals shouldn't be bred, and ideally they shouldn't be sold to other collections where they can potentially infect other animals. But if there's no clinical signs, there's no reason not to keep those animals as pets and keep them for as long as they've got a good quality of life. So it's not the case that they necessarily all need to be euthanized as soon as we discover they're positive, but we've got to consider obviously the other animals in the collection and, you know, and obviously watch them closely for signs of disease in the future. So as I was saying, you know, like think about reptile shows and reptile expos. There are bound to be animals in and amongst the bustle which are positive. And that's one of the reasons why, you know, at reptile shows you have hand sanitizer on every table, and you know people are sort of discouraged a large amount of the time from handling animals and transferring disease between tables. It's spread by transmission of body fluids, so that could be saliva, that could be feces. A common sort of way that it will be transmitted snake to snake would be during breeding. In theory, if you've got a positive snake and you keep it in a room with other snakes, but there's no transfer of bodily fluids, if you're very, very rigorous with your hand hygiene and with cleaning, you know, water bowls and handling tools and feeding tongs and all the rest of it, potentially you could have snakes that remain uninfected in the same room. It's typically, a lot of these reptile diseases are not frequently sort of airborne diseases. It's very different to the situation if, say, you had birds in a room, where a lot of bird diseases are airborne. In reptiles, that's often not the case. That's not to say it's not possible. But there's a lot to be said for having sort of good biosecurity measures in place. And one of the really sort of common sort of ways that this is transmitted is via snake mites. And you've got to bear in mind that if you bring mites into your collection, it's been shown that mites can colonize an entire snake room within 48 hours. And so they are a very efficient way. Obviously, they're biting the snakes, they're consuming blood. And that's a very sort of efficient way for bodily fluids to be spread around any collection. So take snake mites seriously. A lot of people will sort of have the attitude of, I'll treat mites, I'll give them some frontline, and we'll get rid of the mites, and you know, and they don't see snake mites as this sort of horrible, you know, sort of disease. But snake mites can be very serious, and they can transmit some very serious diseases. So do take mites seriously. And as I say, just because an animal is positive does not mean it will develop inclusion body disease. So just because an animal is positive for a rhinovirus, if it's a rhinovirus positive, does not mean that it will develop the disease, which is inclusion body disease. This is a histological image from the spleen of a boa constrictor. And you've got various cells here within the spleen, and these sort of purple deposits within the cells that are denoted by the arrows, those are the characteristic inclusion bodies that we see with this disease syndrome. So it's you know, we can be very suspicious when we look at a biopsy or when we look at tissues after post-mortem. So I think arenavirus and inclusion body disease is still probably by far and away the most common sort of viral disease that we see on a day-to-day basis in private collections. But there's this second viral disease that is very much up and coming, and that's nidovirus, which you'll often also see described as serpentovirus. So serpentovirus is nidovirus. Nidovirus causes it. And that is a virus that we've literally only sort of found out about in the last 5 years, I would say. Maybe slightly longer than that, but it's a very sort of recent discovery, but potentially this is something that's been causing us problems for a long time. It's, again, a virus that predominantly affects boids, and this one is particularly common in pythons, and actually boas are affected to a lesser extent. And the sort of flagship species of nidovirus is the green tree python, I would say. And initially, when what was happening is we were getting these big sort of severe respiratory disease outbreaks in collections of snakes. And what we saw initially was that they tended to be the ones that were nidovirus positive tended to be in collections either where there are a lot of green tree pythons, or they were in other species, but it was collections where there were also green tree pythons. And you know, we don't know sort of whether this is something that originated, say, in Indonesia and has come with sort of imported green tree pythons, but certainly that species seems to be a little bit predisposed. So nidovirus is a member of the family Coronaviridae. So I guess it's almost a little bit like COVID-19, but in snake form. And it's related obviously to SARS and MERS. And typically this is a respiratory virus. So if I think about my own clinical practice, I've definitely seen this. This is some of the other viruses that we'll come on to. I've not actually ever diagnosed a case. Certainly arenavirus I've diagnosed many cases, and nidovirus I have as well. And the two species that I've seen nidovirus most in are green tree pythons and also amethystine or scrub pythons. So there was one study that looked at 95 pythons and 84 boas from around Europe. So they just tested them to see if they were nidovirus positive. And 27.4% of the pythons were positive and 2.4% of the boas were positive. And actually in that study, it was most common in ball pythons. Potentially that's because ball pythons are more common anyway, and there is a higher number of ball pythons, and they're obviously kept in a higher concentration than many other snakes. A study in the USA showed 85 out of 144 infected pythons showed clinical signs, but there was still a significant number that never showed any signs, even though they were confirmed to have nidovirus. And only 1 out of 8 boas that were infected showed clinical signs. And they did also find nidovirus in 1 colubrid as well, but that was asymptomatic. So again, this is one of these viruses that doesn't necessarily always cause disease. And it seems to be that pythons are sort of more affected than boas. And we don't know about colubrids. Potentially they can be infected. They can be infected, but potentially they can be affected. And time will tell as we learn more about this virus. With nidovirus, we get respiratory signs, pneumonia, in all of the cases of nidovirus that I've seen. And this isn't necessarily the case with other viruses, things like arenavirus. I've seen arenavirus in snakes with respiratory disease. But in all cases of nidovirus, they always seem to have this stomatitis, in my experience. You know, if I get a green tree python or a scrub python with a respiratory infection and it's got stomatitis, stomatitis is mouth rot. So I'm very, very suspicious then that that nidovirus could be the cause. And as well as these respiratory signs, this sort of ongoing progressive respiratory infection with this sort of clear mucus from the mouth and all the things you typically see when you've got a snake with an RI, sometimes you can just get a snake that shows no clinical signs and actually just dies suddenly one day, and you go in and you find it dead and you're not sure why. Because it hasn't really given you much warning that something was wrong. So this is, as I say, sort of this stomatitis that we see quite commonly when we've got nidovirus infections. So have a look for that. Again, some snakes have been shown to carry it for more than a year. It usually remains there. So usually if you catch nidovirus, and this is the same with arenavirus, it's usually there indefinitely. We don't know whether it's possible for animals to clear it long term. Potentially it is in some cases, but more research is needed to establish whether that's the case. And it's transmitted again through respiratory secretions, through feces, you know, potentially through, you know, reproductive secretions and breeding activity as well. And as with arenavirus, so for both of these viruses, and actually for many of the viruses that I'll talk about tonight, we can test for them. And there's a PCR test available for nidovirus, which we typically run on a tracheal swab or on a tracheal lavage sample. So tracheal lavage is basically where we put a flexible soft tube down the windpipe, the trachea, and we put some fluid into the lungs temporarily, and then we suction it back out straight away. And we send that sort of wash then from the windpipe and potentially from the lungs as well for virology and see if we can find nidovirus. This is a picture of sort of a tracheal wash. So snake's glottis, the opening to the windpipe, the opening to the trachea is right at the front of the mouth, unlike in mammals. And we sort of pop this tube down and pop some fluid in there. And that's something that can be very sort of sensitive and a bit more sensitive sometimes for detecting things than just swabbing. And, you know, this is something that if you suspect, you know, a viral problem, it's something that you might want to have a discussion with your vet about. Particularly if you do a few tests and you're sort of struggling to find out what the cause is. So we've done arenavirus and IBD, and we've done nidovirus. Now, the third viral disease that we sort of talk about frequently in snakes is PARAMYXO virus. And PARAMYXO virus is a disease that I have seen and I have identified, and I've certainly known is there, and I know colleagues that have identified it. But I've not identified it anywhere near as commonly as the first two viruses that I've spoken about. And PARAMYXO virus is another one of these viruses that we've known about for quite a long time. So it was first described in the early 70s, and it's the furlavirus genus of PARAMYXO viruses that are most relevant in snakes. And they're called furlovirus because the sort of original outbreak that happened where a lot of snakes in one room died, it was in a zoological facility, I believe. A lot of those snakes were fur-de-lance vipers. So PARAMYXO virus is definitely something that is sort of associated with viperids in general. Whenever we've got mass mortality and we've got neurological or respiratory signs in vipers, this is something that we should always suspect. But it has been described in other snakes as well. And we do see it in boids, we see it in elapids, in colubrids, in crotalids, and potentially we might see it in other, families of snakes too. So it's a very, unlike the first two, where we sort of only really have identified big problems in boas and pythons, this one definitely will affect colubrids and venomous snakes and also boids. So this potentially has quite a wide host range. And we've also seen PARAMYXO viruses in other reptiles as well, and it certainly has been infrequently described in lizards. And it causes neurological and respiratory signs in snakes. In lizards, it tends to cause predominantly respiratory signs. So it's a pneumonia that we most frequently see where lizards have got PARAMYXO virus. And the species where it's certainly been described, if you look at the literature, are emerald tree monitors and caiman lizards. So definitely this should be something on our radar when we've got respiratory signs in those species of lizards. So I've got a picture here of a viper. You can see on sort of this open mouth breathing is something that we would typically see when we've got a snake with a severe pneumonia, severe respiratory disease. The snake is struggling to get enough oxygen, so it opens its mouth to really sort of draw in as much oxygen as it can. And then we've also got the neurological signs that we see as well. So this sort of stargazing type, twisted neck, torticollis type presentation. Now, PARAMYXO viruses that affect the majority of reptiles tend to be furloviruses. But there is one specific PARAMYXO virus of importance which isn't a furlovirus, and that's sunshine virus. And sunshine virus is again a neurorespiratory disease, and this is something that's associated mostly with Australian pythons, mostly snakes in the genus Morelia. And this originated in Australia. That's where the first cases were seen. And the reason it's called sunshine virus is because those initial cases that were discovered were found in the region of the Sunshine Coast, which is on the Queensland coast on the eastern side of Australia. But although it originated in Australia, and although in theory there is very little leaving Australia these days anyway, we do see it in Europe as well. And in Europe it's been described in ball pythons in Germany. And this is, again, something that, animals can be asymptomatic, even though they're infected with it. So for many, many months, you may have a completely healthy animal, even though it's infected with sunshine virus. And ultimately, that animal may then at some point go down with neurological or respiratory disease. Whenever we've got an Aussie python, a carpet python, or one of the other Australian pythons that's, suffering from a respiratory infection or respiratory disease, or indeed snakes housed in collections where there are lots of Australian pythons or any Australian pythons. I mean, sunshine virus is always something that we should consider. And again, we are lucky in that a lot of these viruses nowadays, whereas we couldn't 10 years ago, but nowadays we can test for them. And again, sunshine virus, we can do a PCR test on oral swabs. So I think sunshine virus is an interesting one. And I've not diagnosed a case yet, but I'm sure I will with time. So we've got, I think this is an Irium dryar carpet python here, showing sort of the typical neurological signs. So this could be nidovirus, well, probably less likely to be nidovirus, but this could be arenavirus. So if you've got, multiple carpet pythons in a collection showing neurological signs, sunshine virus, arenavirus, potentially PARAMYXO virus, lots of viruses that we need to consider. Fine, so that's 3 of the common viruses out the way. Now moving on to adenovirus. Now these viruses predominantly affect lizards, and a gamid adenovirus is sort of the most common adenovirus that we see in captive reptiles. It's found all over the world. It's found in the US, it's found in Europe. We have a lot of it in the UK. I've diagnosed many cases of adenovirus over the years in bearded dragons. And although it's mostly seen in bearded dragons, it's not exclusive to beardies. I've personally diagnosed it in blue-tongued skinks, and I know colleagues that have identified it in other sort of diurnal lizards, predominantly in agamid lizards. But who knows as to what other species may be susceptible. And adenoviruses in general, sort of in the animal kingdom, I mean, adenoviruses are very common. We see them in birds as well. We can see them in other species. They typically affect juveniles more so than adults, and that certainly seems to be the case with a gamid adenovirus, although we do see disease in adult animals too. And with adenovirus, you tend to get an enteritis, so you tend to get this sort of inflammation of the gut. You tend to see gastrointestinal signs, an inability to absorb or digest food, weight loss, diarrhea. And then you also see neurological signs as well. And frequently this disease is fatal. But again, some animals will carry this for years and years and years. And this is endemic in a lot of bearded dragon breeding facilities. So you can see this is a bearded dragon that's got splayed legs. It can't really has lost control of its limbs to some extent, and is also doing this characteristic stargazing behavior. And I guess the main differential here, the thing that you'd think about, would be metabolic bone disease. You'd also consider that this animal could have a calcium or vitamin D3 deficiency. Well, there might be something else going on. It might have a thiamine deficiency because it's got heavy parasite burden or something wrong with its diet. But certainly any beardie that presents like this, adenovirus has to be high up on the list. Now, as well as affecting lizards, adenoviruses can affect snakes. They've been reported mostly in boas, so in boa constrictors and in rosy boas, sometimes in viperids and colubrids as well. And in snakes, you typically will get neurological signs, but you will also get liver necrosis. Sometimes you'll get a sudden death. And interestingly, with adenovirus infections in snakes, you do see skin lesions sometimes. So if you've got a boa constrictor with some neurological signs and also dermatitis lesions, adenovirus may be something to consider. Fine, so moving on swiftly, and now we're on to herpes viruses. Now, herpes viruses, although we see herpes viruses in lots of different types of reptiles, are most frequently an issue with chelonian species, so in tortoises and turtles and sea turtles. And herpes viruses obviously can affect lots of species. They affect humans. And people with cold sores will be well aware that, herpes viruses, once you've got them, like a lot of these viruses that we're going to mention, but certainly with herpes viruses, once you've got them, you've got them. Once you've got herpes, you've got herpes for life. And that's the case with reptiles as well. And herpes viruses commonly cause liver disease, and certainly in aquatic turtles, that's typically what we observe. So sort of liver inflammation, hepatitis, and liver necrosis. In land tortoises, we tend to see respiratory disease more commonly, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. And then in sea turtles, we tend to see this sort of grey patch disease where you get these grey patches over the sea turtle's body, and also this fibropapillomatosis. So this is a sea turtle here. I think this is a loggerhead sea turtle. with, can you see these white tumorous lesions? So herpes virus in sea turtles causes fibropapillomatosis. Fibropapillomas are benign tumors, and you either get these tumors externally, like this turtle has. They also can get them internally. And although they're benign, they are large and they compress things. And if they grow on the eyelids, they can restrict vision. And if they grow sort of in the mouth, they can affect eating. And if they grow near the flippers, they impede the turtle's swimming. And very often, as things progress, even though these tumors are benign, they eventually lead to secondary consequences which turn out to be fatal. And this is a very debilitating disease and is very, very common in some populations of sea turtles. So I think from memory, turtles around Hawaii and turtles around Florida are often said to be particularly commonly affected, and sometimes 50 to 70% of all the sea turtles in those areas can have these fibropapillomas. If one of these turtles is rescued and brought into captivity, then the treatment of choice really is to try and remove a lot of these tumors and try and remove them with a fair amount of healthy tissue around them, so with good margins to try and reduce the likelihood that they will come back. But there's obviously a very good chance that the turtle will develop more tumors again in the future. In our tortoise species that we see, our Mediterranean tortoises, what we typically see will be a respiratory disease. So we'll see eye signs, ocular signs, nasal discharge. Very, very characteristic of herpes virus in tortoises is you get this ulceration and necrosis of the mouth. You get a really nasty mouth rot type situation. In terms of diagnosing it, we can do a PCR test, and we can also look for inclusions on histology. There is a drug that has been used to treat herpes virus called acyclovir. Acyclovir is a antiviral medication. It's what they use to treat cold sores and genital herpes infections in humans. So Zavirax is acyclovir, and acyclovir is not going to cure the herpes virus. You're not going to get rid of it from the collection, but it may, to some extent, reduce the clinical signs. So in a pet tortoise, a much-loved pet tortoise that is not a risk to other animals, and that we want to ideally provide with as long as we can, with good quality life, treatment with acyclovir, this antiviral drug, is certainly something that we can consider. And obviously, we would give any animal that's suffering from a viral infection supportive care. We frequently would give antibiotics as well, because the immune system is so preoccupied and the animal is debilitated because of its viral disease, and therefore is going to be very prone to developing secondary bacterial infections. So I've got a couple of pictures here. The picture on the left is a tortoise with these sort of ulcerative white plaque-like lesions on the tongue and sort of on the mucosa inside the cheeks. And that would be something that we very commonly see with herpes virus. And then on the right, you've got a tortoise that's bubbling from the nose. And respiratory infections in tortoises are really common. And I guess probably the most frequent sort of organism that we see in sort of this runny nose syndrome in tortoises is actually a bacterial disease, something called mycoplasma. And it can be important to distinguish, whether we've got mycoplasma or whether we've got herpes. And, mycoplasma is much more likely to respond to treatment with antibiotics. In my experience, tortoises that have, although they can present initially very similarly in terms of the signs, this sort of stomatitis, the stomatitis is more common with herpes virus, but can be seen with mycoplasma as well. But with sort of runny eyes, runny nose, in my experience, the herpes virus affected animals are far sicker than the mycoplasma infected animals, and and they tend to respond less well to treatment and are more likely not to make it, sadly. So moving on to I think this is the last but one group of viruses that we see really commonly in reptiles, and that's RANA viruses. And RANA viruses are a huge problem in amphibians. And as far as reptiles are concerned, they tend to be something that we see mostly in chelonians again. And sort of what we tend to see will be this sort of, typically we'll see skin lesions, sort of edema, sort of like swelling, fluid accumulation under the skin. And very often in chelonians, we'll get a lot of edema developing around the neck, around the cervical region. And there's this sort of swollen neck, reddened neck, has in the past been called red neck disease. And we now know that RANA virus actually is implicated in that process and in those cases. We'll often see nasal discharge and conjunctivitis and sort of respiratory signs. RANA viruses, whereas a lot of these other viruses are quite species specific, RANA viruses are not. RANA viruses are seen in many other different types of animals, not just reptiles and amphibians. And RANA viruses can be transmitted between different classes of animals as well. And RANA viruses are something that a huge amount of research is being sort of done on them at the moment. They're a very sort of popular topic. And I think there's something that we're going to sort of learn a lot more about as the years go by, and we're going to realize that actually they're probably a bigger problem than we think. It's still sort of relatively rare. It's not something that I've diagnosed very frequently at all in practice, but I'm sure I will diagnose it more as we learn more and as we look for it more. So, final group of viruses are reoviruses. And reoviruses cause disease in lots of different types of reptiles. Various snakes and lizards can be affected. Reoviruses tend to cause respiratory signs often, certainly in 100 flower rat snakes, so sort of Melendorphi rat snakes. Fatal respiratory disease has been observed and described. We see reoviruses in rough green snakes, where it tends to cause liver disease. We can see sudden death in iguanas. Lacerta species, these sort of Mediterranean green lizards, they will often develop papillomas, so sort of little skin growths almost when they're affected with reovirus. And reovirus has been described in boa constrictor too, but that animal didn't show any clinical signs. But that's not to say that reoviruses can't cause disease in boids, and we suspect they probably do. So I think, there are lots more viruses that I haven't covered, but those are probably sort of the big, most common ones that I would encounter on a day-to-day basis. So if we just think now, as we get towards the end of this presentation, some general principles really in terms of preventing viral diseases. So the first thing obviously is quarantine all new arrivals. It's so important, and it's something that still is massively neglected. And ideally, if there's a particular virus which is common in that species, like if you've got a boa constrictor, arenavirus is so common. A third of them have it, we think. Then whilst they're in quarantine, it's worth testing them for that virus. And ideally, obviously sometimes you don't quite get your swab in the right place and the virus is there, but you just don't manage to find it. So with all of these tests, false negatives are possible. And so ideally, while they're in quarantine, we would take serial samples for virology. So ideally, at least once while they're in quarantine, and then once before they leave quarantine as well, just to be absolutely certain that we've not got a problem. In terms of, people always ask, what is the ideal quarantine period? And it's a very difficult one to answer. When you consider that a lot of these viruses can sometimes, hide there silently in the background for many months, you could quarantine an animal for 6 months or a year, and you might still be bringing in some nasty virus. I would say ideally a reasonable and, and sort of logistically possible, practical quarantine length would be 90 days. A lot of things, you're going to sort of get a hint of within that time period that the animal's just not, it's losing a bit of condition. It just looks like it's losing a bit of weight, or it's just not eating that well, or there's subtle signs developing. So 90 days gives you a good opportunity to observe things that aren't quite right. And obviously, if an animal isn't quite right, then it should be kept in quarantine and potentially investigated for what's going on. One of the things that you've got to remember with quarantine is that it's really important that wherever you're quarantining animals, you have an all-in, all-out policy. So if you're quarantining one snake for 90 days, but then 70 days through that quarantine period, you buy another snake, which you put in your quarantine viv. You know, say you've got a viv with tubs inside it or something, that's your quarantine space. Or you might be lucky enough to have a separate room where you can quarantine things. But, you know, you could be exposing that first snake to new pathogens with the new snake that you put in quarantine. So you can't sort of stagger new animals coming into your quarantine facility. You've got to sort of have them all in and then all out, and have them all in for the same length. If possible, don't keep high-risk species with other susceptible species. You know, mixed boa and python collections. Boas are a very, very common reservoir for things like arenavirus. And if you've got pythons there as well, which are far more susceptible, you know, they're going to be at much greater risk of going down with something compared to a collection where there's just pythons. Really important to keep mites out of your collection. And, you know, it's all very well treating animals and quarantining animals, but don't forget that mites lay eggs, and mites can be brought in from wholesalers and dealers and shops and shows, you know, in substrates that have been pre-packed, where there are animals surrounding them in the same building. And the same with sort of pieces of cork bark and pieces of cage furniture, used vivs, you know, particularly used wooden vivs with little crevices. So just be very, very careful, you know, with mites, and, you know, and consider where you're buying things. Make sure all the, you know, the equipment that you're buying in ideally is you know, treated in a way to prevent mites from entering the collection before you put those things in with your animals. And take steps to prevent cross-infection. You know, as I say, disinfect, hand hygiene between animals. Even animals long-term which are in your collection, they might have things that may cause you a problem a long time in the future. And if you practice good hand hygiene and you disinfect your feeding tongs and everything else, you know, it might be that when you do have a problem in the future in some animals, you find that it hasn't spread completely throughout your collection because you were very careful about cross-infection. And one of the things that, you know, is my real bugbear that we do see quite commonly, and is a brilliant way to spread disease, is sharing food items. So if you offer your, you know, pied royal python a large mouse and it refuses it, and then you go and offer it to your exanthic royal python because you don't want to waste the mouse. You know, if that snake has tongue flicked the mouse, the first snake, then potentially it's infected it with something. So, you know, don't, if a snake refuses a food item, you know, generally best to discard that item rather than share it around the collection. In terms of then sort of, you know, things that I think all hobbyists should consider, obviously disinfection. Using a really good disinfectant when you're cleaning things is important, and the one that I would recommend, and the one that we use in my veterinary practice for cleaning our tables and our utensils, is F10. And F10 is widely available and has been tested against lots and lots of different relevant veterinary viruses, and has been shown to be very effective. So and also is very safe to be used around animals. So stock up on F10. F10 is definitely good stuff to have around. If you have got a quarantine room, or you want to really thoroughly disinfect the whole room after animals have left, particularly if you've got a bigger collection, then you could consider a fogging device like this picture in the middle, where you put your F10 or your disinfectant in the reservoir, and then it sort of produces it in a fog-like form. And the benefit of that is obviously the fog gets everywhere. It gets on top of the door frames and behind the vivs, and, you know, in all the little crevices, and is probably the most efficient way to disinfect a room. And also I've put this picture here of quite a sort of clinical setup with this Herptech Viv that's very easy to clean, with a plastic hide, disposable water bowl, disposable substrate. This is the kind of thing that you want to have for your quarantine area. You don't want to quarantine animals in elaborate bioactive setups. and you can obviously put them in once you're happy they're healthy. But for sort of identifying secretions and diarrhea, and just for being able to clean and sterilize things, and if you do have a disease problem, hopefully being able to get rid of it from your quarantine environment. Keeping snakes in a clinical fashion is the way to go, definitely. Few really important things just to consider before we finish. And the first thing is, the thing that will prevent your snake from going down with the virus is its immune system. And good immune status, even if you've got an animal where there is a virus in the collection, if those animals have good immune systems, good strong immune systems, they may never become sick. And obviously it's the animals with the sort of immunocompromised that are the ones that are most likely to develop these sorts of diseases. And immunosuppression is caused by stress. And so ensuring your husbandry is optimal, suboptimal vitamin D levels, for example, and this is obviously a very contentious, popular subject at the moment, but certain species are not provided with UV often, and we know that animals that have suboptimal vitamin D levels can have poor immune function and may be more predisposed to developing diseases. So do consider providing the best possible care that you can for your animals, particularly things like leopard geckos and crested geckos. I really think those animals, we're at a point now where we can say they need UV. It's so difficult to ensure that they're getting enough vitamin D just purely from their diet. So advice in this day and age would always be to give them the option and to give them that UV source. Obviously, buy from reputable sources. Avoid buying wild caught animals because they are stressed and they've come from an environment where they've been exposed to different viruses out in nature potentially. Avoid high stocking densities, and screen regularly for parasites. And if ever you have an unexplained death in your collection, try and work out what the cause of death was. And if you take, your animal to your exotic vet, they will be able to do a post-mortem. And ideally, with a post-mortem, what you want is a post-mortem with histology as well, because the best pathologist, the best sort of post-mortem performing person in the world cannot see inclusion bodies with a naked eye. So have the post-mortem done and then have some samples of different tissues sent for histological examination as well, and that can all be arranged by your vet. So I hope that's useful and helpful and interesting. And obviously if you've got if anyone's got any questions, then feel free to submit them afterwards, and I'm sure the organisers will get them to me and I can get some replies out. But thank you very much for your attention, and I hope everyone's staying safe, and I'll hand you back to Jenny to finish.
Thank you very much. Incredibly interesting. Sorry. There was the one question that I was trying to think about during the whole of that, even though you answered quite a lot of them as we went along.
Sure.
Do you think there will ever be any sort of vaccinations for our reptiles or snakes, like you do get with a lot of exotics?
It's possible. There aren't really any reptile vaccines, any commercial reptile vaccines available, certainly not in Europe. And I think one of the reasons potentially is because there just isn't, it costs a lot of money to develop a vaccine, to do the trials, to demonstrate that it's effective and that it's safe. And I think reptiles are a very niche, still quite a niche market, sort of when we're thinking about pharmaceutical companies and things. So I think there often isn't the economic incentive there for people to do it. But you never know. Watch this space. I mean, it'd be brilliant if we had, say, an arenavirus vaccine or something in the future, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. Or even just something, even in general salmonella, the different strains, just with obviously with everything coming out with the Emergence Disease Foundation and what they say are the risks of zoonotic diseases from keeping exotic pets.
Absolutely.
It would just be an interesting extra little bit to have on the side to help, I suppose.
Yeah, it might happen. I don't know. Maybe. There's nothing about reptiles. I don't think that means that vaccines aren't a possibility.
Good. I hope maybe We'll have to see how the hobby goes. If it becomes more popular, it might be more of a viable option economically. Or
Yeah, definitely. Watch this space.
I shall. But other than that, thank you, thank you very much. That was incredibly informative. And hopefully people will take in a lot of that information, and hopefully, if anything, it just makes them even aware of certain symptoms that they may see that would get them to a vet quicker than normally.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for coming. It's always lovely to have the veterinary side. So
Yeah,
thank you again.
have a lovely evening, and the same to everyone listening at home.
Andrew, any more questions, and I'll let you know if we get anything in. Hopefully you'll get something, but if not, and you answer whenever you've got time, don't worry.
Fine. Okay. Thank you very much then. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.